Gradually, the Army of Occupation assembled at Corpus Christi. When it was all together, it consisted of 7 companies of the 2D Regiment of Dragoons, 4 companies of light artillery, 5 regiments of infantry, the 3D, 4th, 5th, 7th, and 8th, and 1 regiment of artillery acting as infantry, not more than 3,000 men in all. General Zachary Taylor commanded the whole. There were troops enough in one body to establish a drill and discipline sufficient to fit men and officers for all they were capable of in case of battle. The rank and file were composed of men who had enlisted in time of peace to serve for $7 a month and were necessarily inferior as material to the average volunteers, enlisted later in the war expressly to fight, and also to the volunteers in the war for the preservation of the Union. The men engaged in the Mexican War were brave, and the officers of the regular army, from highest to lowest, were educated in their profession. A more efficient army for its number and armament, I do not believe ever fought a battle than the one commanded by General Taylor in his first 2 engagements on Mexican or Texan soil. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. The presence of United States troops on the edge of the disputed territory furthest from the Mexican settlements was not sufficient to provoke hostilities. We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it. It was very doubtful whether Congress would declare war, but if Mexico should attack our troops, the executive could announce, whereas war exists by the acts of, etc., and prosecute the contest with vigor. Once initiated, there were but few public men who would have the courage to oppose it. Experience proves that the man who obstructs a war in which his nation is engaged, no matter whether right or wrong, occupies no enviable place in life or history. Better for him, individually, to advocate war, pestilence, and famine than to act as obstructionist to a war already begun. The history of the defeated rebel will be honorable hereafter, compared with that of the northern man who aided him by conspiring against his government while protected by it. The most favorable posthumous history the stay-at-home trader can hope for is oblivion. Mexico showing no willingness to come to the Nueces to drive the invaders from her soil, it became necessary for the invaders to approach to within a convenient distance to be struck. Accordingly, preparations were begun for moving the army to the Rio Grande, to a point near Matamoros. It was desirable to occupy a position near the largest center of population possible to reach, without absolutely invading territory to which we set up no claim whatever. The distance from Corpus Christi to Matamoros is about 150 miles. The country does not abound in fresh water, and the length of the marches had to be regulated by the distance between water supplies. Besides the streams, there were occasional pools, filled during the rainy season, some probably made by the traders, who traveled constantly between Corpus Christi and the Rio Grande, and some by the buffalo. There was not at that time a single habitation, cultivated field, or herd of domestic animals between Corpus Christi and Matamoros. It was necessary, therefore, to have a wagon train sufficiently large to transport the camp and garrison equipage, officers' baggage, rations for the army, and part rations of grain for the artillery horses, and all the animals taken from the north, where they had been accustomed to having their forage furnished them. The army was but indifferently supplied with transportation. Wagons and harness could easily be supplied from the north, but mules and horses could not so readily be brought. The American traders and Mexican smugglers came to the relief. Contracts were made for mules at from $8 to $11 each. The smugglers furnished the animals and took their pay in goods of the description before mentioned. I doubt whether the Mexicans received in value from the traders $5 per head for the animals they furnished, and still more, whether they paid anything but their own time in procuring them. Such is trade, such is war. The government paid in hard cash to the contractor the stipulated price. Between the Rio Grande and the Nueces, there was at that time a large band of wild horses feeding, as numerous, probably, as the band of buffalo roaming further north was before its rapid extermination commenced. The Mexicans used to capture these in large numbers and bring them into the American settlements and sell them. A picked animal could be purchased at from $8 to $12, but taken at wholesale, they could be bought for $36 a dozen. Some of these were purchased for the army and answered a most useful purpose. The horses were generally very strong, formed much like the Norman horse, and with very heavy manes and tails. A number of officers supplied themselves with these, and they generally rendered as useful service as the northern animal. In fact, they were much better when grazing was the only means of supplying forage. There was no need for haste, and some months were consumed in the necessary preparations for a move. In the meantime, the army was engaged in all the duties pertaining to the officer and the soldier. Twice, that I remember, small trains were sent from Corpus Christi with cavalry escorts to San Antonio and Austin with paymasters and funds to pay off small detachments of troops stationed at those places. General Taylor encouraged officers to accompany these expeditions. I accompanied one of them in December 1845. The distance from Corpus Christi to San Antonio was then computed at 150 miles. Now that roads existed is probably less. From San Antonio to Austin we computed the distance at 110 miles, and from the latter place back to Corpus Christi at over 200 miles. I know the distance now from San Antonio to Austin is but little over 80 miles, so that our computation was probably too high. There was not at the time an individual living between Corpus Christi and San Antonio until within about 30 miles of the latter point, where there were a few scattering Mexican settlements along the San Antonio River. The people in at least one of these hamlets lived underground for protection against the Indians. The country abounded in game, such as deer and antelope, with abundance of wild turkeys along the streams and where there were nut-bearing woods. On the Nueces, about 25 miles up from Corpus Christi, were a few log cabins, the remains of a town called San Patricio, but the inhabitants had all been massacred by the Indians or driven away. You are listening this book at VolantLife Radio. San Antonio was about equally divided in population between Americans and Mexicans. From there to Austin there was not a single residence, except at New Braunfels on the Guadalupe River. At that point was a settlement of Germans who had only that year come into the state. At all events they were living in small huts, about such as soldiers would hastily construct for temporary occupation. From Austin to Corpus Christi there was only a small settlement at Bastrop, with a few farms along the Colorado River, but after leaving that, there were no settlements except the home of one man, with one female slave, at the old town of Goliad. Some of the houses were still standing. Goliad had been quite a village for the period and region, but some years before there had been a Mexican massacre in which every inhabitant had been killed or driven away. This, with the massacre of the prisoners in the Alamo, San Antonio, about the same time, more than 300 men in all, furnished the strongest justification the Texans had for carrying on the war with so much cruelty. In fact, from that time until the Mexican War, the hostilities between Texans and Mexicans was so great that neither was safe in the neighborhood of the other, who might be in superior numbers or possessed of superior arms. The man we found living there seemed like an old friend. He had come from near Fort Jessup, Louisiana, where the officers of the 3D and 4th Infantry and the 2D Dragoons had known him and his family. He had immigrated in advance of his family to build up a home for them.